for a time after the bombing, had military people with town. Americans aren't used to that. So what then happened was, although the president and many others said this is not a war against Islam, and there's a difference between Islam and extremism.
Words used at the beginning of the campaign,
sure,
like the Crusades, infinite justice, which really brought...
well, I think that there's a contradiction there, and I wouldn't deny that, but initially it's important to realize that the distinction was made publicly by the administration and others between Islam and extremism. The problem is that for many Americans and many policymakers, what they saw was that the attackers were Arab and Muslim. And they saw that within a context of an Iranian revolution, the taking of hostages in Lebanon, the slaughter of more than 225 Marines in the Marine barracks in Lebanon, a memory of hijackings of the past, the attacks against embassies in Africa, the USS Cole, the attacks in Saudi Arabia. And so there was this last iteration, and there were voices within America that not only look at those events within a context, but rather distort it. So those militant voices that want to talk about a clash of civilizations, those same voices who at the Oklahoma bombing were ready to blame the Muslims, suddenly came out of the woodwork again and made those statements. The other thing that fed it, as you said, is not only at times the use of words like crusader and infinite justice, but the way in which then this administration, that is the American administration, chose to prosecute the war. It went from bin Laden and al-Qaeda to overthrowing the Taliban, and after the Taliban,
the axis of evil.
To then talk about axis of evil, to talk about a second front, to talk about possibly going into Somalia, into Iraq, into Southeast Asia, and then more recently, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think, that just made things a lot worse.
We have Jane on the line. Hello, Jane. Hello, Jane.
Hello.
Yeah, hello, Jane. Can I have a question, please?
Thank you for taking my call. I have observed a strong belief among many of my Arab and Muslim friends in a conspiracy theory in which it's believed that the U.S. and the UN is plotting against Muslims around the world. And I'd like to know if the doctor feels there's a basis to this conspiracy theory. And second part is, if there isn't, how can it be counter-argued? Thank you.
I think that's a good question. I think that regrettably, one observation I would make is that too often we fall back on conspiracy theory. I mean, I've been traveling and studying the Muslim world for 30 or 35 years. And, when in doubt, come up with a conspiracy theory. But the fact is, there can be conspiracies. That's the other side of it. With regard to this idea of the U.S. and the UN, usually you hear things like the U.S. and Israel, or Mossad. I think that's, from my point of view, I don't see the evidence. And part of what I would say to people is, if you want to put a conspiracy theory out there, that's fine. But the conspiracy theory ought to be drawing off some very solid evidence. And often when you're in a conversation...
Isn't there solid evidence, for example, of how the UN and the U.S., for example, treats the Iraqi issue, and then how it treats the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, and then how it treats the Palestinian-Israeli issue? There are resolutions which have been passed for more than 27, 28 years, Resolution 242, 328, 181, and Israel is not complying with any of these resolutions. Recently, with the invasion of the Palestinian territories, there was a UN resolution which called on Israel to withdraw, but no voice was heard. And we find that America describes Sharon as a man of peace and Arafat as a...
All of that's true. But
so
why no, but I mean, all that's true, so why not draw some logical conclusions from it, instead of simply saying conspiracy theory? That's not a logical conclusion. What one can conclude is that there's a problem with American foreign policy, and one can conclude it and put it within a broader context and say that there's been a tilt towards Israel historically for decades. That doesn't qualify as a conspiracy theory, and particularly to link the UN. I mean, the fact is there have been, as you know, sectors within the UN and many UN votes which have been supportive, in which America has abstained or vetoed. If anything, both America at times and certainly Israel have always claimed that the UN is anti-Israel. So the idea of linking the UN on this one, I think it's a bad rap for the UN and for Kofi Annan. If one wants to focus on U.S. policy, yes. Why does the American administration do what no administration in recent memory has done, and that is twice on 2 resolutions, participate in drafting resolutions that in fact are aimed at Israel, vote for them, and yet virtually on the same day or within the same week, while that's going on in New York, in Washington, the President of the United States is simply saying that Arafat's got to deal with the terrorism, and Arafat's responsible for it, and then saying something like Sharon is a peacemaker, or saying with the resolution, you have to be out in a few days, and here we are now, months later, and still allowing what is called, the cleansing. In that sense, I think one can perfectly, logically critique U.S. policy and say that it needs to change. The risk is when we simply try to throw it into the conspiracy theory, because conspiracy theories, I believe, are often thrown out when people feel impotent. You don't have to feel that way. One can simply say, okay, here are the issues, we're going to address them, and we're going to critique, and we're going to pressure.
So what can we do? So Jane was saying, if there's no
what can be done?
What can be done?
Well, I think that among other things, I think that certainly it would be really nice if some of the Arab and Muslim rulers became a lot more vocal, and if there was more.
But can they become more vocal? In a sense, they're dealing here with the only superpower in the world, which has economic and military power, which can.
At the end of the day, you can't go through life always making excuses for why you didn't act. That's the reality. If you believe in justice, there are times when you speak out.
So do you think, as an expert and as an American,
the Arab League should...
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
So, for example, what can if you were in the position of the Arab leaders and the decision was in your hands, what can they do, for example, to help change U.S. foreign policy in the region, but at the same time not jeopardizing, let's say, U.S. interests?
I certainly understand the sense of not only Arab leaders. I mean, it's the frustration of some Europeans and others who basically see a kind of unipolar world. The United States has all this power. But the fact is, it seems to me that leaders have to be both strong in private as well as in public, in delineating what their concerns and their issues are, and make it clear to the United States. Mr. Sharon feels free to publicly disagree with the United States. Mr. Shamir, Mr. Begin, Mr. Netanyahu have always felt free to do that. Now, there will be those who will say, but Arab leaders don't have the same leverage. But
they don't have the Israeli lobby in there.
That's right. Well, number one, then maybe they need to get their act together better and get themselves a stronger lobby. But number two, this part of the world is responsible for a fair amount of oil that the United States is dependent upon. This part of the world remains, America operates as all countries do on national interest. And the fact is, America has not walked away from the Middle East, and many or some in the region are upset that it's as visible as it is. But what is that signaling? That this area of the world is seen as important to America because of its resources. Okay, that provides some leverage. But the fact is that it's going to take Arab leaders saying something. It's going to take Arab and Muslim organizations like the OIC, and the Arab League to be far more aggressive in what they're doing. And it's going to take commentators and journalists, etc., to be far more aggressive. Not simply yelling about conspiracy theories, not simply writing simply emotional editorials, but writing, good reasoned pieces, which some Arab, which some in the Arab media do. I mean, we follow it, whether I'm in the region or in the States. But I think there has to be more of a sense. I'm not at all naive in saying that there's any kind of parity, of power between Israel and the Israeli lobby and the Arabs. But certainly, this is not only true now, it's true in the past. A lot more headway, could have been made and should be made. And a lot more, visible expression of being upset. The simple belief in Washington, when some Arab leaders do speak, often the belief is that, well, what Arab leaders will do and Muslim leaders is talk quietly, behind the scenes, because they're not going to challenge, because some are dependent on aid or, whatever. But even when they do speak, what you will usually hear is then an administration official, not only Bush, but in the past, basically say to the American people, well, that's what they say for home consumption. But privately, they say something else. Well, I think that has to be changed.
Professor, when the September 11th attacks happened on the U.S., of course, there was, as we said, Muslims in America and the rest of the world targeted. Of course, the Muslims in America and Europe, and even the Muslim world, reacted. Do you find that the response to the attack and their reaction was proportionate to what attacks was happening on them?
I think that one of the problems that we initially had was that many Arabs and Muslims were A, completely stunned, certainly in America, B, many felt threatened in terms of how's this going to affect us, the fallout. But see, there was another problem, and that is that for many Arabs and Muslims, the community, some communities have been very self-contained. After September 11th, initially, there was a quiet. Many were saying, why aren't there more people speaking out about September 11th? Why aren't there a whole group of religious leaders saying this is un-Islamic? You know, why is it taking so long for that? You know, but many then, you know, took up the fight and became more visible. And mosques realized that they needed to open up and reach out to their neighbors, etc. So a lot of that, you know, began to occur. But it occurred a bit late. There was a lag time. On the other hand, one has to be, you know, very blunt about it. Arabs and Muslims in America, some, not all, have experienced, as in Europe, the fallout from this war. Okay, the fallout. The reality of it is that unless things get much, much worse, many of the Arabs and Muslims I know in the United States, although they realize and are